UCL East is the biggest single expansion of the university since it was founded nearly 200 years ago. So at the moment we've got the first phase. This is the main academic building, Marshgate. It's 35,000 square metres of space, and there's Poole Street West, which is mainly a student accommodation building, and between them they're home for 4,000 students and 700 members of staff. So that's a significant transformation, but in the longer run the whole of UCL East is 180,000 square metres of additional space, which is equivalent to about 40% of the Bloomsbury campus. I think, however, the main challenge, and what is really important to understand, is that this is not just about scale. It's about the ambition to create a completely new type of campus and academic building. So that's very much about a realisation that the knowledge that's needed to answer the problems, the issues that we have globally today, is found not in within the traditional disciplines, but very much between the disciplines. It's about the interaction between different forms of knowledge. So this campus and this building is all about breaking down silos, breaking down barriers. It's entirely about interdisciplinary working. So for us as architects, what that meant was we were not simply moving existing faculties into this building, we're moving entirely new programs, all of them interdisciplinary. So we were asking academics, what might you be teaching, what might you be researching in 7 years' time, beyond that, future generations of research and teaching, and then looking at what facilities were needed to support that and how they could be adaptable for the long term and into the future. We were always well aware that it would need to stand as if you like, a strong sculptural element amongst the other family of objects and object buildings in the park, the orbit, the aquatic centre, the stadium. And then in the longer term, it's also part of UCL's more urban master plan for the whole area. And as part of that master plan, we were given a volume, and you can see effectively the volume here of the footprint and the height of the building were determined, and that's partly to do with the routes that are projected through the site in the long term. So we have a model that shows how we, if you like, carved that volume. So the collaborative spaces at the heart of the building express themselves on the facades in these big windows and openings on each facade. And in the ground floor, when you look up through the building, you can see the way that the footprint of the building is divided into almost separate building blocks, with these streets, public streets, running through the building. So that's how we derived this particular massing within the park. There's a real ambition on this site that it's not simply about the academic work and engagement between the different academic activities, it's also about engagement with the public and the local community. So from the start, the brief was to draw the public into the ground floors of the building. So we have ground and first floor are fully publicly accessible, and there are public-facing activities. There's a public cafe. There are also spaces like the lecture theatre and community classroom, which will be bookable for public events. And those ground floor spaces we envisaged very much at the scale of almost public streets and squares. So there are routes through the building at ground floor level from each facade into the central atrium space. Above that you get the academic floors. Those are very flexible, adaptable floor plates. And then at the top of the building are the more specialist facilities. And we have some very specialist laboratories in this building, tackling things like programs for zero carbon transport solutions and cutting edge technologies, nanotechnology, surface engineering. So all that's happening within the building, but the key to the concept of how we approached it was that the building's designed around the collaborative areas, this collaborative heart. So each of the floors, or the groups of floors, are clustered into what we call vertical neighbourhoods. So they're clusters of 2 to 3 floors, each one with its own collaboration space. This is one that we're in at the moment, and each of those spaces orientates and opens out onto a different section of the park. So as you work up the building, you have almost these horseshoe shapes of floor plates with big windows opening out 2 or 3 stories high onto the park outside and onto wider views of London in the context. So your experience of the building changes as you move up, but you're always drawn back to this collaborative heart and the shared communal space. So the material palette is deliberately quite industrial in character. It's contrasting with perhaps the more commercial architecture of the International Quarter. It's got a solidity, the building as a whole, of things like the Millennium Mills out in Docklands, that sort of infrastructure type quality. And that's partly to do with a building that has a very long-term vision. It's also to do with a building that has sustainability at its heart. So although these were, we were designing this in 2016, so that's pre-Letty standards, actually it was very much aligned with the approach that would be good practice now to facades. It's more solid than glass, very high levels of insulation, all the glazing is shaded from solar gain, and the facade is part of the long-term fabric of the building. It's not like a curtain wall facade that could be taken off in 35 years and discarded. This is a building that's here to stay, and that's been very much the approach. We have always been very aware of the issues about concrete and embodied carbon, and I think for 20 years we've been working with high levels of cement replacement, and also the use of concrete being very much part of pushing down the operational energy within a building, and that's been the strategy here. It's a high performance building. Loadings on the frame are up to 5 times what you'd expect in an office building. There are very rigorous vibration criteria. We've had to consider things like explosions. At one point, radiation shielding was in the design. All of that is driving a high performance concrete frame. So once we have that as a decision, we think if we were to go through the analysis now, we would still be looking at a concrete frame. We then look at how you can reduce the concrete. There's 40% cement replacement in the frame, up to 70% in the substructure, and in fact the use of the concrete is very much integral to this idea of a long life, loose fit building, high levels of adaptability, and we're using it to moderate the internal climate as well. So we're making the most of what we have. Everything around the central circulation spaces, the atrium, the more public areas of the building, is all either exposed concrete or birch-faced ply, and that's about having a very robust palette of materials which is going to last in the long term with very limited maintenance. I think this building in many ways builds on our experience of other previous designs. So the idea of focusing on the collaboration space, the spaces between the more adaptable activities, that's a philosophy that we've been developing since the Sainsbury Laboratory and our work at Central St Martin's, and more recently at the Design Centre for Research as well for Great Ormond Street and UCL. At the moment we're not working on anything at this scale, but we're doing a lot of work for colleges at Oxford and Cambridge, and in terms of research and specialist buildings, we're designing the new extension to the Royal Marsden Cancer Hospital, which has again some very high performance complex requirements. As you go up, you have the more specialist spaces for research and teaching, and it is a very high performance, highly technical building, so with a lot of demands on the systems and on the structural performance. So you can see in these kind of spaces a lot of equipment. There are a lot of fume cupboards in this building, but what we're trying to do here is to ensure that you still get very good daylight views into all these spaces and the connection back to the atrium. So these run right the way across the floor slab, the floor plate. So you get the connection to the heart, but also always to the landscape outside. We had an idea that we were looking at lots of traditional public spaces in cities, the way that some Italian piazzas have multiple levels, that you're on a terrace of a building looking down onto the activity below, and that's very much how this atrium space is envisaged. So on each floor you're looking down onto a terrace on the floor below as it changes in section as you move down the building.